My name is Byron Odeon. In November of 2017, I recorded an interview with Richard Hart and Ken Bevis for a radio show I had at that time. It aired on KTRT 97.5 FM in the Methow Valley on January 1st, 2018. I then added it to my YouTube channel, Voices of the Methow. Richard will describe how his book Lost Homeland came to be and will give a detailed account of its contents. Ken will share how he became involved and how their collaboration culminated in several presentations they gave from Wenatchee to the Okanagan and Methow Valleys. I should explain that after Richard finished his description of the book, I left the recorder on, and I'm including the ensuing conversations that developed. Before we begin, Ken is going to start us off with his song Methow Band to set the mood.
Summer's coming on, sunflowers are thick. I got my weir out for some fish. I'm hoping for some bright spring chinook. My wife and kids are out digging roots. Come sitting by the river and talk for a while. I'll tell you about my life this day, 'cause we're living with the land, whoa, whoa, we're the Methow Band. Oh, we've been here since time first began to live at peace with Okanagan and Chelan. My grandma used to camp right over there. I was born yonder on that big flat rock. The roots are rich, the deer are fat, there's salmon in the stream. We thank the Great Spirit every day, 'cause we're living with the land, whoa, whoa, we're the Methow Band. Oh, salmon in the stream. We thank the Great Spirit every day, 'cause we're living with the land, whoa, whoa, we're the Methow Band. Well, I got some fine horses, would you like to trade for some? That red one, he is fast and he's strong. Got all that we need for everyone and more. Our families are part of this land. The roots are rich, the deer are fat, there's salmon in the stream. We thank the Great Spirit every day, 'cause we're living with the land, whoa, whoa, we're the Methow Band. The roots are rich, the deer are fat, there's salmon in the stream. We thank the Great Spirit every day, 'cause we're living with the land, whoa, whoa, we're the Methow Band.
Richard, you recently wrote a book titled Lost Homeland and have given several presentations about it. And Ken, you've written several songs for the presentation as well. Let's start with you, Richard. Could you give us a brief description of yourself and your book for those who may not be familiar with you?
So I'm Richard Hart. I'm a historian. I have worked with tribes for about 50 years, which dates me a little bit. And about 20 years ago, I started working with the Colville Confederated Tribes. One of those tribes is the Methow. I did a big report, and eventually I turned that report into a book, which is the book that came out last August.
And how about you, Ken? Could you talk a little bit about yourself and your music?
Well, I'm Ken Bevis, and I'm a wildlife biologist and a guitar player and a songwriter. And I was hooked up with Richard by way of a connection in Wenatchee, where the museum director had heard me sing for a different presentation. And she had the brainstorm of putting these two things together. I've been writing songs for 40 years, not quite as long as you've been a historian, Richard, but getting there, which dates myself. And I've been in the Valley here for a while and inspired by nature, and I like to sing and write songs.
Well, I'm going to turn this over to Richard. What have you got for us, Richard?
Thank you very much, Byron, and it's nice to be here. As I said, I started working for the Colville Confederated Tribes about 20 years, a little over 20 years ago, in the mid-1990s. And I do expert testimony for tribes in litigation. So the kind of history I do is very detailed with a great deal of documentary evidence, the kind that goes to court and bores most people to death. When I do a report, I hope that one person and one person alone will read it, and that's the judge. So I did a big report for them about the Moses Columbia Reservation, which once included all of this valley, the Methow Valley. And it kind of just sat there for 15 years or more. And tribal members of the Methow Tribe and other people over on the Colville Reservation, as well as people in the community around here, asked me if I couldn't turn it into a book. Over the past 4 years, I worked with a number of people and tried to make it readable so that a general audience would not fall asleep in the first paragraph. And
well, I'll tell you what, I didn't. Congratulations to you on a job well done.
Oh, thank you very much, Byron.
Concur.
Thank you very much, Ken. The Schaefer Historical Museum decided that it would publish it, and I made a deal with the tribe so that I donated the author's royalties to the Tribal History Archaeology Office. And then we got very generous support from community members to help print the book. So all of the proceeds as a result are going to the museum and to the tribe, which is really great. I should mention a couple of people especially that helped on the book. Karen West and Solveig Torvik here in the community helped a lot. Karen worked with the huge photographic archive at the museum and selected photographs to go with the book. And we tried to select photographs of the Methow people that have not been published before, so most of them have not been seen. There are a few Matsuro photographs in there that have been published before, and a couple of maps that have never been published. Both of them, by the way, were editors in Seattle newspapers before they moved here and retired here. And Solveig worked with me to try and make it readable. And I would say, to put it in the shortest way I can, she made me think about every single sentence in the book, and I rewrote a lot of it. I always assume a judge is going to understand a lot of things, so writing for the general public was a very different matter for me. So eventually we got the manuscript done, and it's published, and it's been out for a few months. The story of the book is basically, it's Lost Homeland, but it's about the Moses Columbia Reservation. So the Methow and this valley were pretty isolated compared to the rest of the Pacific Northwest, compared to most of the West. Spanish immigrants were in the Southwest in the 16th century, and here white people didn't really reach this valley till the late 19th century, so a few centuries difference. So the Methow people were very isolated. They were first impacted by Europeans when disease reached the valley, in the late 18th century. In the 1770s, between 1770 and 1810, the population of the valley and of most of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest was reduced by 75% or more. So the population of the tribe may have been 2,000 or 3,000 in 1750, and by 1800 it was probably 300 or 400. So it was a huge loss, and of course the disease reached the people here before they ever saw any white people. So they probably didn't have any idea what the disease was and where it was coming from. It came village to village up the Columbia, and also there were some epidemics that came from the Missouri over the Rocky Mountains from tribes that way. So it went tribe to tribe to tribe. Some of the tribes clear down by the mouth of the Columbia were completely wiped out. A couple of the Chinookan tribes were completely destroyed. Nobody was left at all. The Methow people here were really impacted before they ever saw a white person. To understand their history a little bit, I should mention a little bit about subsistence. They hunted and gathered and fished. They had a huge salmon run, several species of salmon. Ken can speak more authoritatively about that than I could. They also dug a lot of plants. Bitter root was important to them. There's a lot of bitter root in the valley. They used all kinds of different trees and plants for other purposes. They still strip pieces off the roots of western red cedar for basket making, and they use a number of other different plants for basket making. The hunting was done communally, so they could take 20 or 30 people out and do a drive and have a blind, and drive the deer toward the blind, and then have a couple of people that were good shots with bow and arrows to dispatch the deer when they came to the blind. So after the population loss, subsistence became much more difficult. As a result, when the first trappers and traders got here, Fort Okanagan in 1811, 1812, the guns that they had were really advantageous to the people. A gun, even a musket with a ball and powder, allowed one person to go out hunting alone, and they were good hunters. So guns were really important. Metal pots were really important. Canvas became very important. It was much more effective to make a canvas teepee, a canvas lodge, than mat lodges. Mat lodges were very time-consuming and took lots of people. So they started trading with the British, French fur trappers, the Hudson's Bay Company, in the early 19th century and traded through the mid-19th century. Then the United States came. Now, the early trappers were interested in trade. It was a commercial operation for them. The Indians had something they wanted, the furs, and the trappers had something the Indians wanted, the guns and the pots and everything. When the United States got out here in the mid-1800s, they wanted something else. They wanted the Indians' land. So it was a whole different interrelationship between the white people from the United States and the white people from the trappers that had been there before. Under the Constitution, it was well-established law that before white people could move on to Indian land, what's called Aboriginal title, the Indian title to the land, had to be extinguished. That's why we had treaties. Under the Constitution, there were really only two ways to extinguish Indian title. One is by conquest, by war, and the other was by treaty, by agreement. And by the time the United States got this far west, they had realized that it was much cheaper to make a treaty than it was to try and fight a war. And so when Governor Stevens, the first governor of Washington Territory, arrived here in the 1850s, his first priority from the United States government was to do treaties with all the tribes and extinguish Aboriginal title so that white people could move in. And so he set out to make treaties first along the Pacific coast and did some treaties over there in 1854. And then in 1855, he came over here, and in 1850, he was at Walla Walla, and he did a series of treaties there, one of them the Yakima Treaty. The Methow here were invited, at least theoretically, to go down to that. They didn't participate. If anybody was there, we don't have any evidence of that today. The Okanagan were also invited. the Chelan and Entiat and Wenatchee representatives went, and a couple of their members did sign the treaty. That's a whole different story. Right. But nobody from the Methow signed the treaty. They weren't parties to the treaty. So in 1855, the Yakima Nation was created. The treaty was actually ratified in 1859. It was actually ratified 4 years later. So there was a war in between because the Indians thought the treaty was intact and the United States didn't until Congress ratified it. So the Methow are up here still relatively untouched. There are no white people living in the valley. There may have been a couple of guys that moved in with Indian women, but for the most part, this was all Indian country and there were no intrusions. I mean, there are a few explorers that came through. They tried to find a route over the mountains and failed. The main route the Indians used was going up either Chilliwack Creek or one of those creeks over there and then coming down Benson Creek or coming over Loop Loop Pass and then crossing and going up the Twist River and going up to War Creek and then down to where today's Stehekin is and then up over Cascade Pass. That was the main route to the Skagit, although they did have a way to get there over Washington Pass. But most of the people, when they were traveling to trade with the other side, went over Cascade Pass. So there wasn't much contact with non-Indians here. And then white people started to move further and further into the north, what we call north central Washington. First of all, they crowded into the Colville Valley, and eventually the Colville Reservation was established in 1872, which included all of the country from the Canadian border, which had been established in 1846, but not surveyed until the 1860s. So, and then it went from the Canadian border and was surrounded by the Okanagan River and the Columbia River, a big reservation. But white people wanted that too, and they wanted this territory over here, and they wanted the Waterville Plateau, they wanted all that land. And there were generals who had been through the Civil War, including O.O. Howard, who had also fought against Joseph in the Nez Perce. And they really did not want another war. They wanted to reach an agreement and avoid any more bloodshed. They'd seen a lot of bloodshed, been a lot of huge loss of life in the Civil War, and a lot of the Indians died too in ancillary wars. So Howard started talking to people to try and find out how he could avoid war in the region. And Moses, who was the chief of the Sinkayous, or the Columbia people, and they're the people that lived up on the plateau on the other side of the Columbia, east of us. Moses had had some education. He could speak English. He may have been able to read and write a little bit. And he realized this was an opportunity for him and maybe for his people to take advantage of. And so he claimed that he represented all the tribes in the region. He said he was the leader who represented the Okanagan, the Methow, the Chelan, the Entiat, the Wenatchee, everybody. And if they didn't make a treaty with him, he was going to raise a big army and go to war against the United States. And it wasn't true. I mean, he was popular among his own people, but he was certainly not a leader of the Methow or the Entiat or the Chelan or the Wenatchee, and they eventually let the United States know that that was not the case. But Moses was a real talker, and he convinced the United States to do an agreement with him, and he created, as a result, the Moses Columbia Reservation. The President of the United States signed an executive order creating the Moses Columbia Reservation, which was essentially an extension of the Colville Reservation, which went from the Okanagan River on the east to the crest of the Cascades on the west, and from the Canadian border all the way down to Lake Chelan. So that's a big reservation. So that was created without the Methow people here in the valley ever knowing anything about it. Nobody ever contacted them. Their whole land had just been turned into a reservation, their entire territory. Their territory included the whole Methow Valley, much of the upper drainage of the valley. Some of the northwest region of the drainage was Okanagan territory, but they were very close to the Okanagan. There were a lot of intermarriage. And then they controlled Chilliwack Creek and a couple of the creeks just north, upriver from today's Pateros, where the Methow drains, and then a little bit down river too, where there used to be villages all the way down along the Columbia River where Wells Dam is today. So that used to be there. I've heard reports that there were hundreds of lodges that were along the river in that area. So the Methow didn't know anything about it. Nevertheless, even though they had this reservation set aside with, in a very short period, white people said they wanted this country too. So eventually they said, okay, well, Moses, you're going to have to sell part of your reservation. So first he sold a 10-mile strip along the Canadian border. And then they said, we need to make a deal with you to open the whole reservation to non-Indian settlement. And so they made a complicated deal. They took him to Washington again, along with a few other leaders, but mainly it was Moses. And Moses agreed to a deal where he got a new house, $1,000 a year, and the reservation was open to non-Indian settlement. But the deal for the people that actually lived here, like the Methow, they were supposed to have an option. And the option for them was they could either move to the Colville Reservation or they could get 1 mile square, 640-acre allotments, like homesteads. And the Army was instructed to inform everybody and inform the Indians of this. And so the Army went around to the people that lived on people who actually lived on where the reservation was, which included Okanagan people on the west side of the Columbia, and the Methow people and Chelan people and Entiat people. A lot of Entiat people had moved up along Lake Chelan. So there were both Entiat and Chelan people up there. Unfortunately, the military, when it got here, it only went to the mouth of the Methow River. They didn't really realize that people moved around seasonally. In the summer, people were up in the mountains hunting and gathering berries that were available only seasonally. The Methow were only given an opportunity to create a few allotments down at the mouth of the Methow. And what they tried to do was protect their villages down there. They had about 20 villages up and down the river in the valley, and they did some allotments right at the mouth of the Methow, and then a few further down toward Wells Dam, and then up toward Chilliwack. But nothing up here in this country. At that time, most of the people were up in the upper valley. And also the military finally talked to Methow people for the first time. And there's a great speech that I record in my book where the Army officer asked, it was actually Loop Loop, the person living on Loop Loop Creek. Either the creek's named after him or he was named after the creek. I don't know for sure, but that's where the term Loop Loop came from for our little resort. And he was asked what he thought about this whole deal, about the reservation, and he said, you white people say we shouldn't drink, we shouldn't lie, we shouldn't cheat, we shouldn't murder, we should be honest, and yet you have made Moses the leader over us, and he's a liar and a cheat and a drunkard and a murderer. He put it pretty bluntly.
Man ain't no better than his deepest, most sincere words. All people are just the same. We treated you with friendship, then you lied and took our land away. Our world was so good, you stole our future away. We're sad, we're sick, and we're broken. Yesterday is all there is. Yesterday is all there is. Now stranger's land, far, far away from our ancestors' graves. We tried to live in peace on the river and deep in the hills. Our world was so good, you stole our future away. We're sad, we're sick, and we're broken. Yesterday is all there is. Yesterday is all there is. Our homeland is lost. Our homeland is lost. Our homeland is lost.
And nevertheless, that was a done deal. And so the Methow, most of the Methow were gathered up. And we have a great view right where we are of the Smoke Jumpers Airport across the valley. And Methow people say that that's where they were gathered up and moved at gunpoint. And of course, there was no airport then. But that was the location where they were gathered up and moved at gunpoint to the Colville Reservation.
What year was that?
That would have been 1886. The reservation was established in 1879 and opened to non-Indian settlement in 1886. So from the Methow people's perspective, first of all, their land was turned into a reservation and they had no contact, nobody talked to them about it or anything. And then second, it's open to non-Indian settlement, and nobody talked to them about that. And a lot of people simply said, we don't want allotments, this is our land. Who are you to come say that you can just take our land? I mean, they had no idea how big and powerful the United States was. So that's what this book is about. I also touch a little bit on the continued close association that the Methow people have with the valley, and people still come over here, have always come over here for the past 130 years. It's harder to hunt and fish today. They still they dig bitterroot, they come over and get strips of root for basketry. Women come over every year. And there are families in the valley that are close with tribal members and allow them to come visit. I think there's more and more interest on tribal members to come over. They used to come a lot more. We have lots of photographs of Methow people here between 1886 and 1935. In the 1930s, the state started to enforce hunting and fishing laws that they had established. And tribal members that tried to hunt would have their guns confiscated, which was a really big deal to them. That was their subsistence. And they would also have any fishing equipment confiscated if they tried to fish. And a lot of Methows got sent to jail. And families remember those stories very strongly today. So the Methow tribe continues to exist. They're one of the Confederated Colville tribes, and they still have an interest here. The Colville tribes are the sovereign body that represents the Methow. They have a lot of objectives which are similar to our own objectives. They opposed, at least to my objectives, they opposed the copper mine and strongly registered their opposition and threatened to litigate in their opposition to that. They also opposed the helicopter training base. So I think that in the long run, they're good partners for us. I will just mention that when back in the 90s, I took a group of people over a period of a week or 10 days up and down the valley, tribal elders, to identify use areas and village sites. And when we got up to the area around Mazama, they showed me one of the places where they did vision quests, an important religious activity for children going through puberty. One of those areas was right where they wanted to do that test drilling. So they registered their complaints about that and said that would be incompatible under the law with their rights. And so I think that in the future, one of the things I hope that can come out of this is a closer partnership and relationship. One of the things white people ask me, I've heard this question many times, is, well, do the Indians want our land? And I've heard their answer enough that I'm not answering for them, but I'm not an Indian, but I can tell you what they would say, which is, we've had that done to us, we wouldn't ever do it to anybody else. So that's basically an overview of the book.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you, Richard. I think this is a good place to stop for now. Like I said in the beginning, I left the recorder running, and I'm glad I did. You can go to part 2 to continue the conversation between Richard and Ken. Ken's going to take us out for now with his song, Methow My Home.
I had a dream, I was flying in the sky like a free bird on the wing, dreaming of loving home in places and in faces, drifting on the breeze with open heart. Then I spied a valley, smiling verdant green, a river running through it, meandering and clean. Beautiful place, cleft from the high Cascades, jagged peaks surrounded. The smile on my face, I think I found it. Oh, the Methow, my home. Oh, the Methow, my home, home, home. Wander the world, I found where I belong, in this Methow, my sweet home. Let me describe it to you. Well, riverbanks covered with cottonwood so fine, hills above are solid, ponderosa pine. Balsam root exploding, wild yellow in the spring, red-tailed hawks and meadow larks fly and then they sing. Tiny flowers hide beneath blue bunch and bitter brush. Brown season comes, leaves fall down, autumn's golden shine. Winter comes quickly, the snow begins to fall. Wide world, it goes to sleep, to awaken in the spring in my home, in the Methow, my home, in the Methow, my home, home, home. Wander the world, to find where I belong, in this Methow, my sweet home. History. Well, native peoples lived here, gathered through the years, digging roots, catching salmon, or hunt those big-eared deer. Their spirits lay upon this land, mingled with the trees. We walk their trails, see their skies, feel the Methow's peace. Then came the homesteads, the miners, loggers too. The ranchers and the farmers worked the land for me and you. So many came before us, to them we owe great debt. We'll try to keep this valley fine, but that is work that ain't done yet, no, no. In the Methow, my home, oh, the Methow, my home, home, home. Wander the world, I found where I belong, in this Methow, my sweet home. Break. Oh, do 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 do. Now the future is upon us, computers, flying cars, the crushing modern world, but here we see the stars. Get out and visit with your friends, the Mercor at the barn, Mazama Junction or on the trail, love is never far. Young people laugh and sing, clear eyes and open hearts. Their world is new, their minds are fresh, soon they'll do their part. We make our way together, we celebrate this land. We raise our voice, we clap our hands, and we sing to our home, to our home. Oh, the Methow, our home. Oh, the Methow, our home, home, home. Wander the world, we found where we belong. In this Methow, our sweet home. In the Methow, our home. Oh, the Methow, our home, home, home. Wander the world, we found where we belong. In this Methow, our sweet home. In this Methow, our sweet home. In this Methow, our sweet home.